woman named Donna Halper, who was a DJ in Cleveland, played Working Man on the radio, and the phone didn't stop ringing. Pictures is the next step forward. It's the moment when Rush becomes a full-on popular band in the mainstream.
From the moment Mick and Keith met through to U2 as a high school band in Dublin, how did our biggest music legends make the leap? Passion, talent, luck, and even scandal often came together to propel these stars from obscurity to household name. The stories, the journey, the wild behind the scenes, and much more. I'm Dave Anthony, and I'm the host of From Garage to Stadiums. Welcome to Garage to Stadiums. Today's story is about the band Rush. Rush is a Canadian band hailing from Toronto, Canada, and consists of lead singer Geddy Lee, guitarist Alex Lifeson, and drummer Neil Peart. And this is a band known for its loyal legion of fans worldwide, attracted to the precision musicianship of this band, whether on record or in concert. Rush is third behind only the Beatles and the Rolling Stones in number of consecutive gold or platinum albums. And to talk about Rush and its journey is Sam Dunn, an award-winning documentary filmmaker. Sam's first film, Metal: A Headbanger's Journey, premiered at the Toronto International Film Festival in 2005 and has become the definitive documentary on heavy metal music and culture. He's also won the prestigious 2016 Peabody Award and International Emmy Award for his work on the Netflix original series Hip Hop Evolution. Some of the bands that Sam's covered in his docs include ZZ Top, Iron Maiden, and Alice Cooper. Sam's documentary, entitled Rush Beyond the Lighted Stage, made its debut at the 2010 Tribeca Film Festival, where during the 2010 Audience Award, the film was also nominated for Best Long-Form Music Video at the 53rd Grammy Awards, and features an array of rock luminaries commenting on the band Rush. Sam, welcome to Garage to Stadiums.
Thank you, Dave. Pleasure to be here.
All right. Let's first talk, Sam, about Banger Films and your incredible array of projects, films, etc. What was the inspiration to start Banger?
Well, I co-founded Banger with my business partner, Scott McFadgen, in 2004. And it all began with an insane idea, which was that a smart, in-depth documentary should and could be made about heavy metal music and culture, which at that time, for many people, seemed like an absurd idea. But lo and behold, took us 3 years to raise the money, 2 years to make the film. And the film premiered at TIFF 2005 and basically started us on this path of making documentaries and series, firstly with big rock and metal music artists like Rush and Alice Cooper and Iron Maiden and others, and then pivoting into doing series on genres in metal, hip hop, K-pop, pop, and on.
You feature a number of rock luminaries in the Rush documentary, Rush Beyond the Lighted Stage. It's an incredible array of people that are in this one. Gene Simmons of Kiss, Billy Corgan, Smashing Pumpkins, Kurt Hammett, Metallica, Trent Reznor, Nine Inch Nails, Taylor Hawkins, Foo Fighters. I mean, a wide range of genres even in that guest list. And so while Rush was not a band that was loved by the critics, it's incredible the effusive praise that all of these guys heap onto Rush. What was the common view that, they had of Rush?
Well, I think for those musicians, there's two things. One is just the undeniable musical prowess and talent of that band. So, many a young person grows up wanting to be the next Neil Peart, wanting to be the next Geddy Lee, and wanting to be the next Alex Lifeson. So there's that musical side of it that just appeals to young people who just want to become the best at their instrument that they possibly can. And that's very powerful. And it was powerful for me, even though I didn't go on to be a professional musician. I grew up playing the bass guitar, and I sat in my bedroom hitting, stop, rewind, play on my cassette deck, trying to learn how to play Geddy Lee parts. So I could 100% relate to that. I think the other big piece is Rush have had a very unique ability to do their own thing and not cater, not bow, not accommodate the wishes of the mainstream, the wishes of commercial interests, etc. They are one of those very rare artists who have had long careers and have completely done it their own way all the way through. And I don't think there's a lot of artists that tick that box. I mean, Bowie would be an obvious other example, and there's probably others as well. But in the rock world, Rush occupy a very unique place in that they just said no to any outside influence on how they were going to make their music, how long the songs were going to be, how elaborate and ornate their lyrical content was going to be, etc. And I think for musicians that you mentioned, that's like the gold standard, right? That's like getting your cake and eating it too, right? That's the best of all worlds. So I think that's another huge reason why those artists we interviewed in the film have so much admiration for Rush.
Yeah, that's a great point. The point about the musicianship in particular. If anyone in the audience is seen Rush live, I mean, this is a note for note band. When you see these guys, it's like listening. You've got the crowd with you, which is great. But man, these guys are not just phoning it in. This is note for note playing of these awesome songs, and that certainly came through when you talk to those guys. Let's go back to the beginning. Where did the guys in Rush, Alex Lifeson, Geddy Lee, Neil Peart, where did they grow up? What was their family life like?
Geddy and Alex were the sons of immigrant families that grew up in the neighborhood Willowdale in the north of Toronto, which at that time, as I understand, was a brand new suburb in the 50s and 60s. You know, you go any further north of Willowdale, and it was farmland, which of course, for those of people that know the geography of the Greater Toronto area, that's no longer the case. The suburban sprawl goes on for kilometers beyond that now. But that was the neighborhood that they grew up, I suppose, in many ways, kind of a classic post-war, largely immigrant neighborhood. And Neil, quite differently, grew up in the farmlands of southern Ontario, in the if memory serves, kind of Kitchener, Waterloo, down into the Niagara region. His father ran a farm equipment dealership, and so his upbringing was quite different in a lot of ways than Geddy and Alex's.
Yeah. I mean, Getty's family were, you know, I believe that, Holocaust survivors and started a convenience store, and then his father died very early, and
Mhm.
um Alex seemed to be a rebel in his family, trying to quit high school and become this famous. Well, I guess he wanted to be a famous guitar player, but he was already sort of saying, "This is where I wanted to focus." So it was very interesting to see in the doc, even the family videos that you showed. Like, it was really really interesting. Where did they start first playing? Like, how old were they?
Well, Geddy and Alex met in junior high school, I think around the age of 14 or 15. Um, and their first shows were in, church basements, community hall basements, probably a few, high school parties in and around, the northern Toronto suburban area. That's how they really cut their teeth. And so that's where they got their start. Yeah.
These guys are, 19 or 20, and it's in the early 70s. They're playing bars 6 nights a week in Toronto. I mean, they can barely get into bars, but they're in there playing 6 nights a week, and something incredible happens. And tell us about what that was and how it broke Rush into the next level.
Yeah, well, the big breakthrough moment that really put Rush into a much bigger conversation was the result of a woman named Donna Halper, who was a DJ in Cleveland, um, who played Working Man on the radio. And the short version of the story is the phone didn't stop ringing. I think the joke goes, is that the new Led Zeppelin song? The name started to grow, and it sort of paved the way then for the band to start touring throughout that area of the United States. And it was really that radio combined with those early touring days that really broke Rush.
Sam, that opening whip-ass guitar riff by Alex Lifeson is like a machine gone haywire in an industrial factory or something.
Yeah, it's that's a super heavy song. That's emblematic of Rush, as we were talking about earlier, of really being inspired by the Zeppelins and the Who's and that late 60s, early 70s rock sound, right? Like that's where that song is coming from. It's about, it's probably the most straightforward Rush tune ever created. We all know that from there they go off on a vast musical adventure into much more experimental territory. But that Working Man tune is about as bread and butter as it gets for Rush.
Right. So imagine, for those of you listening who have kids, or maybe you're this age, but they're 19 or 20, and this song breaks, as Sam said, the Midwest. They're put on the opening act circuit for bands like Kiss and Manfred Mann and Uriah Heep, and you're 20 years old. Now you're playing not the bars in Toronto, but 10 to 15,000 people every night. It's just incredible.
Yeah, I mean, I think you nailed it with the Gene reference, and I think this speaks to like what makes this band so fascinating is that they, as you say, they really started to hit their stride in those early days of touring the Midwest, and playing loud, heavy, aggressive, musically dense rock music. But they were the furthest thing from what you'd expect a band who plays that music to be like, and that's what Gene gets at in our film is, these guys were not out partying and hanging out with girls. Gene jokes, I think he says, they were in their hotel rooms reading books. So, that just gets to the uniqueness of this band. In many ways, on the surface, they were another 70s hard rock band, but they were different, and they were setting their sights, ultimately, we now know, on far more ambitious and frankly kind of intellectual territory when it comes to what they wanted to do with their music.
How would you describe each of Geddy, Neil, and Alex in terms of personalities?
Oh, wow. That's a great question. Well, in as small a nutshell as I can put them in, I mean, Geddy, firstly, my sense of Geddy is that he's tremendously ambitious. He is a highly motivated individual to understand and absorb as much of the world around him as he possibly can, right? So he's very driven to be the best possible bass player he can be. He's very driven to know as much as he can about baseball. He's driven to know as much as he can about wine and photography and on and on. So that's Geddy to me. Alex is probably the funniest person I've ever met, hands down. And it's something that a lot of people don't know about Alex. But
You wouldn't think that. I mean, he does joke, but the funniest person you ever met, that's saying something.
Alex, you know, my impression of Alex is that he is firstly a fantastic guitar player and plays a very interesting role in that band musically, because Geddy and Neil are such busy note dense players. And
Alex is underrated as a guitar player in my mind.
I think Alex brings, frankly, like a lot of the taste to Rush's music. He's the one in many ways, and people often probably won't see it this way, that's kind of brave enough to sit back and just layer on what needs to be layered on to the music, which I really admire him for. And I don't think he gets enough credit for that, because frankly, if he was ripping on as many notes as the other two, I don't know if Rush's music would be nearly as listenable as it is. But Alex, hands down, is one of the funniest, one of the wittiest people I've ever met, in terms of just being quick on his feet, always having something funny and off the cuff to say in every single situation. It's quite remarkable. Neil, rest in peace, is, you know, the poet in a drummer in drummer's clothing. You know, he's a deep intellectual, he's a deep reader, he's a deep observer of the world around him. And I speak in the present tense because I feel like he's still here because of the legacy of music that he's left behind, right? So he he's probably got the biggest brain of any musician I've had the opportunity to meet, and I've interviewed hundreds and hundreds of musicians over the last 20 years. So Neil is that. He is a deep intellectual, a lyricist, and probably the, if not one of the best rock drummers ever to walk the planet.
Yeah, that's I think that's really fair to say. He definitively comes up in everyone's list, it seems. There's been a number of significant challenges the band has faced. The early challenges after that initial success with Working Man, from watching the film, you know, they put out a couple of albums that are not that well received after that album, that first album that the Cleveland station had discovered, and the crowds start to dwindle to show up to see these guys. And what happens next is really interesting and resulted in a turning point. Effectively, it sounds like the record company sort of put these guys up against the wall and said, okay, guys, this is it. You've had the one hit. The crowds are dwindling. What's it going to be? Because we need something to move some product here. And the band has an interesting response. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I think this arguably is probably the most important moment in Rush's career. After that initial album, their music gets increasingly experimental, and they start really pushing themselves as musicians. Importantly, you know, the original drummer, John Rutsey, who was on the first Rush album, leaves the band, and he's replaced by Neil on the second record, which is an enormously important moment in this band's story, of course, because it kind of opens this vast opportunity to kind of basically create whatever they want, because Neil is so tremendously talented on the drums. But what happens is, by the time they get to the album Caress of Steel, which, you know, I think Geddy jokes in the film, I think we were pretty high when we made that record, is that they've really pushed themselves to the outer limits of experimentation and progressive rock, to the point where maybe, they're starting to push it too far, and there's no semblance, as you say, of a Working Man. The band that made Working Man several years earlier seems to have left the building, and they get put under pressure by the label. The label is saying things like, "We want a hit. We can you guys like put something like a Bad Company song together?" This is the where the label's at that time.
Yeah, and keep in mind, these guys are still, what, 21 probably at the time. Like, I mean, you'd think that the record company says jump, and a 21-year-old's going to go, yes, I will deliver, sir.
Yeah, they're right in their early 20s. This is 1975, I believe, when Progressive Steel comes out. Anyway, the most important word was what Rush said to the record label, and they said no. And they set their sights on creating, which still to this day is probably the most important record in the story of Rush, not necessarily the most commercially successful, but of course that album is 2112. And 2112 still stands as one of the most ambitious and successful, which is key, rock albums of all time. Famously, one side of the record is one song, including several movements, a la a classical composition that might come, as you mentioned earlier, from a Beethoven or a Bach, etc. And the other important thing that happens, of course, is not only that they say no, but the audience says yes in response to that music. And this is the moment when Rush earns their complete musical freedom for the rest of their career. From now on, Rush does things the way they want to, and that's the way it's going to be. And so that's why 2112 is such an important album in the Rush story.
The band goes on to release a trio of albums that puts them into the top rock acts of the late 70s, as it yields songs like Closer to the Heart, that was followed by another key song, Spirit of Radio. Sam, next comes kind of the killer pinnacle album in 1981, when the guys are still like, they're in their late 20s and they've got all this success. But man, this next album is the one that if you were in high school at the time, everybody talked about this album. Tell us about that incredible album, Moving Pictures. Like, what did it do for this band?
Well, Moving Pictures, of course, stands as, the most well-known album by Rush to this day. We touched on it earlier. This is the moment when they start to draw on other musical influences than the kind of classic rock and early heavy metal. The songs get shorter. They get a little leaner, if you will. The keyboards become a bigger part of the actual bedrock of the songs. It's not just guitar riffs that are driving music anymore. And you alluded to the fact that after what they had done on 2112, they pushed themselves even further out into the outer reaches of progressive rock, particularly on the album Hemispheres and songs like La Via Strangiato, where they were now creating songs that they could barely even pull off in the studio. Like they'd kind of, the fingers were bleeding to the point where they're like, okay, let's take the foot off the gas here. But anyway, so with
I guess that speaks to the course correction that they constantly seem to do. They go down a path, they course correct, and as I said at the beginning, To place these guys in any genre is difficult because they keep adapting.
Yeah, and so, the songs you mentioned, like "Closer to the Heart," "Spirit of Radio," and perhaps most famously, "Tom Sawyer," are products of that new mentality that Rush is bringing to their music. Leaner, shorter, uh, more direct, less meandering, less experimental, all of that kind of stuff. And, as Neil says in our documentary, all of a sudden you had kids walking down the high school halls saying, "Hey, have you heard the new Rush song? Have you got the new Rush album?" And as I think he puts it, it's like that's actually the moment, and quite possibly the only moment, that it's been quote unquote cool to love Rush, right? Because those songs that I mentioned are like getting heavy, heavy, heavy rotation on rock radio. And if you've got a radio on in 1981, you're pretty much guaranteed to hear those songs. So yeah, Moving Pictures is the next step forward because it's the moment when Rush becomes a full-on popular band in the mainstream.
We just heard the song Tom Sawyer, the incredible lyrics of Neil Peart, the synthesizers of Geddy, Alex, as you said, filling it in and making it sort of palatable. That song was everywhere in that era. And I've even heard the Foo Fighters sing that song. They loved that song. And I guess that really speaks to how they brought it all together, to your point, in that sort of course correction and integrating some of those early 80s kind of a feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, again, I think they start to develop an interest in finding a more how do they bring a pop sensibility into Rush? And it's kind of an interesting experiment in that sense. Maybe I'm being overly philosophical here, but it's like, how do we create songs that are more accessible, consciously or not, but still retain who we are as Rush? I'm not suggesting that that's the way they approached it, but that's kind of what it feels like in hindsight. Like, how do we be Rush on mainstream radio? Well, I guess Tom Sawyer is probably the best example of that, right? And I think it's just, as in the bigger picture, I think, as you're saying, it just speaks to this band's refusal to kind of stand still, from a musical standpoint, from an ambition standpoint. I think that's really the engine that kept Rush going for so long.
So, Sam, with respect to Limelight, what do you think that is revealing about Neil in particular?
Well, I think this signals a transformation or a shift in the subject matter of Neil's lyrics. For many, many albums, the subject matter has been fantastical, very literary, and very lofty lyrical matter. Now I think it's almost like the lyrics are becoming more earthly and autobiographical. They start to become more about what's going on around them or in their own lives. And specifically, Limelight really kind of echoes what we talked about earlier, which is that this is not a band that does what they do because they want all of the trappings that usually come with being a rock star. In fact, they're in many ways the complete opposite of that, particularly Neil, who, is making this music principally because he wants to make the music. I remember back to, and this may seem like a kind of minutia anecdote, but I think it speaks to something larger, that when they recorded albums, like Neil's favorite part was rehearsing and putting the songs together. And then as soon as he laid the track down in the studio, it's like, I'm done. And then, it was Geddy and Alex, and as far as I understand, largely Geddy, who would spend days and days and days in the studio tweaking and perfecting and working on the nuances of the sound and the production and the levels and all of that stuff. So I think that kind of speaks to kind of Neil as a person. Like, for him, it's the doing of the music that's most important, and everything else around it is kind of either uninteresting or uninspiring to him. And I think that that's kind of what Limelight is getting at, in my view.
Where would you say Rush sits, Sam, in music history? What will they be remembered for? The documentary does a good job of telling what others thought, but where do you think they sit? It's funny. Gene Simmons says people always go, "What are they? Are they this? Are they that? Are they?" And he goes, "They're just Rush, man."
Yeah. I mean, on one hand, I think Rush will always be known as this band that just had the guts to push music as far as it could be pushed within the rock context. Such tremendous musical ambition.
So why did the critics not get it then? What was the critics over time never really fell in love with Rush? There was various reasons. They, silly comments about Geddy's voice or whatever, but I guess it was borne out how everyone feels when they finally got into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and films like yours came out where people were just effusive in their praise.
I've got a long-winded in the weeds answer to this about kind of where rock criticism comes from, which I'm not sure we want to get into. I don't know. It might be interesting, but I think the critics for a long time never gave Rush much credit or praise, because at least through the 70s and 80s, any music that went into or near the outer reaches of being progressive was generally maligned by the rock critic.
The prog rock movement was considered self-indulgent? Was that the idea?
Self-indulgent, over the top, unrelatable, all of those things, right? So I think even though Rush in many ways, was one step towards mainstream rock than, say, a Yes or a Genesis or a King Crimson or a Gentle Giant or all those bands, they still got lumped in with that group from time to time, and I think got maligned for that reason. But honestly, I think the part of Rush that doesn't get highlighted enough, and I think really what they should be recognized for now and into the future, is actually tremendous integrity and tremendous work ethic. And because I've had the wonderful opportunity to spend time with them, especially recently with Geddy, that these guys work very, very hard. And it's maybe a mundane answer, but it's an answer that isn't given very often, because maybe it's not that sexy, it's not that appealing, but there's a tremendous amount of grit. There's a tremendous amount of kind of old-fashioned working class, like, this is what we do for a living. And there's also a tremendous business acumen that doesn't get talked about very often either, that this is a band made a lot of really good decisions along the way. It's a band that was very well managed as well. And I don't think it's those aspects of the band's career that get highlighted enough. But as I've spent more time with them and had a chance to have hindsight on working with them on the documentary now, I think it's those aspects, the work ethic, the business acumen, and the integrity, that is really what made Rush who they are.
That's an interesting answer. You know, it really speaks to these bands are really entrepreneurs at the end of the day, and they're on this journey where they have to adapt and they have to, you know, adapt to the market conditions. They have to do their thing. They have to put in the work. And, you know, in terms of success, it's interesting. While the critics may have said, well, you know, the prog rock, progressive rock, whatever, um, you know, the fans vote with their dollars. And Rush, as we said at the beginning, has the third most consecutive gold platinum studio albums by a rock band, topped only by the Beatles and the Stones. So that's called a successful business. 40 million albums sold is the estimate. And as Sam said, I mean, the work ethic of these guys, you can hear it if you've ever heard these guys live. Like, they're not there to just show up. If you wanted to give the folks listening your all-time 3 picks, I know it's hard, for songs of Rush that they can choose to listen to. Now, we'll have a more in-depth Garage to Stadiums playlist for folks at our website, but I want to hear the Sam Dunn 3 picks that he would say reflect Rush to him.
Wow. It's a big catalog, Dave. The first song that comes to mind is an instrumental, and it's La Via Strangiato off of Hemispheres.
Yeah, people may not have listened to that. That may be a lesser known song, so that'd be interesting.
Which has always been one of my favorite Rush tunes. It just represents Rush at the peak musicality, and I don't think, you know, I'll go on about it all day. I'll be brief, but Alex's guitar solo in that song, I think, is one of the most beautiful parts of any Rush song, and maybe doesn't get talked about enough. So many songs to choose from, but a song I'd like to pick is also a song that maybe doesn't get talked about much. It's off of Moving Pictures, but it's the last song on the album called Vital Signs. And
that's a cool tune. I didn't know anyone else knew that song, so I'm just happy to hear it.
I may be biased because I'm a massive Police fan, and this is their most obvious tip of the hat to the Police that you could possibly imagine. But I love that tune because it's just such a shift in their sound, and I think they pull it off really, really well. It's got that kind of lean power trio vibe to it, and it's got beautiful the vocal work on that song, I think, is beautiful. You know, people talk about Tom Sawyer and Limelight and Red Barchetta and all the other songs off that album, but the last track, Vital Signs, is tremendous, and I think it speaks to the fact that that's why that album is so incredible, is because all of the songs on that album are so strong. So yeah, Vital Signs would be my other pick. I'd pick a song off the album Counterparts, and this is in the 90s, when, after moving into a very keyboard heavy direction in the band's career,
or another move a little too far, it seemed, and then they kind of reeled it back in.
They returned to a much more rock feel on Counterparts, and I've always loved the opening track, Animate, on that album. It's got such a tremendously powerful driving riff, and just sort of gallops all the way through. And the bass playing, of course, I'm a bass player, so I can't help but highlight how tremendous the bass playing is, and beautiful vocals again. But yeah, Animate, I think, is a song that kind of represents Rush into the 90s, which doesn't get talked about very much. But yeah, it's always been a favorite of mine.
Neil Peart, as we've talked about, unfortunately passed away a few years ago. He's widely recognized, you mentioned this, as one of the great rock drummers of all time. I know they've played since, Geddy and Alex, that is, at various tribute events with Dave Grohl, former drummer of Nirvana and headman of Foo Fighters. He played drums, I think, on 2112. He had a concert for the late Taylor Hawkins of the Foo Fighters. And I think at that same event, they even played with Chad Smith of the Red Hot Chili Peppers. You can see those clips on YouTube. They actually played Working Man, so that was kind of cool. Could you see them, Sam? I mean, we're purely speculating. Could you see them pair up with a younger drummer and hit the road again? Who would you love to see them pair up with? Let's ask it that way.
Well, firstly, this kind of feels like sacred territory that I really shouldn't tread on. Maybe I'm a deep enough fan that the idea, the mere thought of someone quote unquote replacing Neil Peart is difficult to address. But I mean, I can throw out one name. I'm not that precious.
Okay. I love it.
I mean, here's the thing. There's probably dozens of young drummers that I've never heard of who are ripping it up on YouTube with millions of views that would be tremendous contributors to Rush. We live in a world now where the bar for musicianship among young people is just off the charts. And of course, YouTube has become the ultimate platform to display.
But is there a drummer, I guess, in an existing band that, is more well known that you went, man, that guy was, if anything, part B for this guy could be playing on a tour with the other two?
100%. And it may seem like an obvious choice to a lot of listeners, but Danny Carey from Tool is, no offense, Danny, he's not the youngest drummer out there per se, but in my mind, if there's a drummer that gets the closest to what Neil has done for drumming, in my opinion, it's Danny. And, Tool is a band that I'm a big fan of, and I think in many ways represents on a philosophical level a lot of the things that Rush represents. We talked about that integrity. We talked about doing what they do. We talked about how to understand the business side of being a band. I admire Tool actually for a lot of the same reasons that I admire Rush on a broad level. So if there's one drummer that I would love to hear play a full set with Rush, or maybe even tour with Rush, again, this almost feels like sacred territory that I have no business treading on, but Danny would be my man.
Yeah. Sam, you rock, buddy. I really appreciate this.
Yeah, no problem.
Special thanks to Sam, our guest today, who produced and directed Rush Beyond the Lighted Stage. And some closing notes on Rush. You can catch the Rush induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame on YouTube. The Foo Fighters inducted them, and there's a great video of Dave Grohl and Taylor Hawkins of the Foos playing that 2112 piece, complete with 70s wigs and rock outfits. If you want some recent clips of Rush playing without Neil Peart, there is that video of them playing the Taylor Hawkins tribute with Dave Grohl, and also Chad Smith of the Chili Peppers taking turns on the drums, playing 2112 and Working Man respectively. And finally, if you want to hear, in my opinion, one Rush album that demonstrates the incredible musicianship of this three-piece band, I'd recommend you stream the album Moving Pictures, widely considered their best album and the one that led to their stadium success. For those of you who want the Garage to Stadium definitive playlist of Rush, go to our website, garagetostadiums.com, where we've posted that playlist, including Sam's 3 picks and the episode's transcripts. While there, you can see our other episodes, and we hope you enjoyed our show today. Special thanks to our guest Sam Dunn of Banger Films and our producer Reese Waters. I'm Dave Anthony, and you've been listening to Garage to Stadiums, another Blast Furnace Labs production. See you next time for another Garage to Stadium story.